Tales of Shipwrecks and Adventures at Sea, edited by James Lidnridge, and published in 1846, opened its story about the wreck of Droits de l'Homme with the following passage. Quote, "The action which was fought between the Droits de l'Homme, a large French two-decker, and two British frigates, under the command of Sir Edward Pellew and Captain Robert Reynolds, on the 13th of January, 1797, was one of the most remarkable in naval history, both from the singularity of its circumstances and the appalling nature of its result."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Long Battle of the Droits de l'Homme.
Here we are. Enjoy!
In late 1796, the French fleet had set sail with the intention of invading Ireland. The troops would never effect a landing. They were met with storms over Christmas that drove the fleet away from Bantry Bay and away from the coast entirely. Among the scattered ships was the Droits de l'Homme, the flagship of Rear Admiral Bouvet, though he had boarded a different ship before the Droits de l'Homme was separated from the fleet. Still, on board the ship was a crew of about 700 under the command of Commodore Lacrosse, as well as around 1,050 troops under the command of General Humbert, and 55 English prisoners. The two-decker, 74-gun Droits de l'Homme had been partially disarmed to serve as a troop carrier, and though she was a large ship, longer than most ships of her class, being separated from the fleet and so close to the enemy was not a favorable position. On the 7th of January, the Droits de l'Homme returned to Bantry Bay in hopes of finding some of the other ships of the squadron, but they were not to be found. The other ships were making their way back to France by now, and the Droits de l'Homme would have to do the same. Commodore Lacrosse ordered that the ship begin to make her way southward, with the intention of heading for Belle Isle. By the 13th, he believed that they were about 25 leagues to the west of France, but the weather continued to not be in their favor, and so they continued to travel southward. The Droits de l'Homme was nearing Brest when two large ships came out of the fog around 1 in the afternoon. Commodore Lacrosse immediately assumed that they were British ships, and he attempted to escape them, even as another storm was growing and things were looking less favorable for them by the minute. Commodore Lacrosse was correct. The two ships were British. One of them was the Indefatigable, under the command of Sir Edward Pellew, and the other was the Amazon under the command of Captain Reynolds. The two ships had been searching for the French ships with no luck for several days, and when they suddenly stumbled on the Droits de l'Homme, there was no chance of them allowing the other ship to go without a fight. By 3:30, the two British ships had managed to make their way to leeward of the Droits de l'Homme's bow, cutting off the chance of the French ships making a run toward land. Still making an effort to get away, the Droits de l'Homme also began to clear for action. Part of this was to move the English prisoners to the cable tier at the base of the foremast. Among the prisoners was Lieutenant Elias Pippon of the 63rd Regiment, who had been captured from a British privateer while traveling from the West Indies back to England due to poor health. He would later write an account of his experience on the Droits de l'Homme, which included his surprise when the commander of the vessel informed him that they were going to be engaging with Sir Edward Pellew's squadron, and that, quote, he would not yield any to English frigates, but would sooner sink his ship with every soul on board. Though they were clearing for action, the Droits de l'Homme was not able to open the ports for her cannons on the lower deck. Her radical design had not only taken away her poop deck, but had also made it so that her lower deck was 2.5 feet lower than it normally would have been. When they tried to open the ports for the cannons on the lower deck during the stormy weather, water rushed in, and they were compelled to quickly close them again. The storm also carried away her main topsail braces and her fore and main topmasts around 4:15. Fortunately for her crew, they still had not engaged with the British ships, and they had the chance to clear the wreckage off the cannons. Her speed was now 5 knots, and 5:30 in the evening, the Indefatigable caught up to the Droits de l'Homme and began to exchange broadsides with them. The Droits de l'Homme continued to be forced to open its lower deck ports for a brief moment to fire the cannons, and then swiftly close them again, which prevented them from firing as quickly as they could have otherwise. But as a larger ship, they were still holding their own until 6:15 when the Amazon caught up and joined in the fight. At 7:30, the two British ships got ahead of the Droits de l'Homme, and there was a lull of an hour while both the Indefatigable and the Droits de l'Homme made some emergency repairs, and then the fight resumed. The seamanship on all three ships was noteworthy, and even as the wind pushed them further and further south, the running fight continued through the night. The two British frigates had positioned themselves to be on either side of the Droits de l'Homme, and eventually her mizzenmast fell. But the British ships were both so pounded by the cannons of the French vessel that by the next morning the Indefatigable had 4 feet of water in her hold, and the Amazon had 3 feet of water in hers. It was reported that the main deck crews of both frigates had been working with the sea up to their middles at times. At 4:20 in the morning, the moon shone through for the first time, and the three ships found that they were alarmingly close to land. Though they did not know it at the time, they had been driven by the wind to Audierne Bay. The Indefatigable was in a better position of the two British ships. She was on the starboard side of the Droits de l'Homme, and was able to change course enough to escape the shore. But the other two ships were in terrible danger. According to Lieutenant Pipon, almost as soon as land was sighted by the three ships, a horrible shudder was felt through the Droits de l'Homme. At the same time, the foremasts on the Droits de l'Homme fell over the side, convincing the English prisoners who were being held in the cable tier at the foot of the foremast that the ship was sinking. Still not certain if they could leave the cable tier, they waited another quarter hour until people shouted to them in French that they should come to the deck as fast as they could, that all was lost. Lieutenant Pipon, who was still suffering from the illness that had removed him from his post in the West Indies, found strength in desperation, and climbed to the upper deck to be met with a scene of horror. The deck was littered with the remains of soldiers and sailors, as well as the wounded. Not a single mast on the ship was still standing, and they were surrounded by breakers on all sides. On one side they could see the Indefatigable, still in danger of striking the rocks, but still safe. Lieutenant Pipon would express his gratitude that the Indefatigable did not take advantage of the situation to fire one more sweeping broadside, because if they had, there would have been no survivors, since everyone had been driven to the decks. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Amazon had just struck the shore about 2 miles from them. The Droits de l'Homme would soon follow after her, and they struck the land broadside, with waves soon crashing over them relentlessly. The Indefatigable, as she was finally able to claw her way out of the bay around 11 in the morning, noted the fate of the Droits de l'Homme, and Sir Edward Pellew and his narrative to the Secretary of the Admiralty expressed his full sympathy for the fate of her brave but unhappy crew. He did not at the time apparently realize the fate of the Amazon, and he reported that the other ship had departed for the northward while they had headed southward, but the Amazon had seemed in better shape than they had been in. The crew of the Amazon was indeed in better condition than the people on board the Droits de l'Homme, even though it had seemed as though they might share the same fate. The people on board her were able to quickly construct rafts, and only 6 men were lost during the evacuation of the ship, though many more had been lost during the long sea battle. Unfortunately for them, they were landing on French soil, and as enemies, they were immediately captured and marched to Audierne as prisoners. Even in this, they were perhaps luckier than many of the people who were on board the Droits de l'Homme. The men on the ship could see the shore lined with people who could not reach them, but were anxiously waiting for them. During the day, they constructed rafts and got boats ready, but then night fell, and with it came a long and terrible wait. The next morning at low water, a small boat was successfully launched, and in it went one of the English merchant captains who had been a prisoner on the ship, as well as 8 sailors. This boat successfully reached shore, and it bolstered the hopes of everyone else that they could also reach shore if they tried. Many of the people on the wrecked ship were desperate. There was no food to be had, and none of them had eaten in the last 30 hours. With this in mind, more than a couple of rafts were launched, but they were smashed and sunk, and all the men who had been on them were lost. That put a pause to all further attempts to leave the ship until the next day. Lieutenant Pipon would later say that it was under the efforts of the English prisoners that the next day the ship's largest boat was prepared and launched, and that they had intended on using it to transport the wounded and the women to shore, but that about 120 people desperately rushed it as soon as it was launched. A huge wave crashed over them at that time, and it would not be until a quarter-hour later that they realized with horror that the boat had been swamped, and that the people who had been in it were all lost. Adjutant General Renier, determined to reach the shore and get help for them, leaped overboard and began to swim, but he was not able to reach the shore before he was also lost beneath the waves. The third night was passed in a grim mood. Half of the people on the ship had been lost at this point, with 200 having been lost in the battle, and everyone else falling victim to the sea. The feeling on the ship was that they would soon all follow in their fate. There was no food or water, and everyone was growing increasingly weak. The only thing that offered them any mercy at all was a half hogshead of vinegar that floated up, and that they were able to each have half a glass of wine to quench their thirst a little. Even when the 4th day dawned more calm, the mood on the ship remained bleak, with everyone on the ship too weak to try to reach the shore again. It was therefore to everyone's relief when that evening a man-of-war and a cutter both arrived on the scene and sent boats out to the wreck. In this way, they were able to pull 100 from the ship that evening, leaving 380 to wait another night before they could give them aid. Unfortunately, the next morning, it was found that this number had been halved. Many on the ship had been too weak to endure, even with rescue so close. At 10 in the morning, on the 18th of January, a boat pulled away from the wreck of the Droits de l'Homme. On board it had a Commodore Lacrosse and General Humbert, as well as Lieutenant Pipon. They were brought to the cutter, where they were given a little brandy and water every 5 or 6 minutes until it was determined that they were ready for a bowl of soup. Afterwards, Lieutenant Pipon reported that he had entered a trance-like state for 30 hours, during which he had swelled up and required immediate medical attention. The men arrived in Brest barely clothed, and having lost everything in the shipwreck, and were each given an outfit by the French government. On learning of the extent of the suffering that the English prisoners on board the Droits de l'Homme had endured, as well as the efforts that they had made to save lives during the wreck, the French government decided to send the prisoners from the Droits de l'Homme back to England without ransom or exchange. Lieutenant Pipon and his companions arrived at Plymouth on the 7th of March, having been among the lucky number who had endured the battle for survival on the Droits de l'Homme. For more information, please see Remarkable Shipwrecks, published by Andrus and Starr in 1813, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.